Welcome back and thank you for watching. We continue now as promised in our last video by arguing why the Magisterium cannot be known to be a necessary, infallible teacher of the faith. By necessary we mean in order to have an assent of faith in the apostolic teaching, without which one cannot discern the infallible teaching of the apostles and prophets from fallible human opinion. By infallible we mean possessing the gift of divine protection from error, such that the teaching does not fail to communicate with the authority of God's own voice, and we are justified in giving its infallible teachings the assent of faith. We consider the process by which a pope or the persons in the magisterium deliberate and then make a judgment about a doctrine and then consequently decide to dogmatically define it. We then consider our relation to this dogmatic definition and where our assent of faith lies. We will see that our assent of faith cannot rest on the individuals in the magisterium, but in the magisterium itself, distinct from them, and this will be agreed to by Catholics. We then consider reasons why we should have faith in the magisterium, such as scripture and tradition. We proceed to argue that scripture and tradition can only provide an infallible teaching supporting the magisterium if faith in the magisterium is not necessary in order to have faith in scripture and tradition. We then proceed to argue that the magisterium must have its own intrinsic motives of credibility. We consider that such motives of credibility, from analogy to the denial of their sufficiency to make scriptures credible, likewise do not suffice to make the magisterium credible. For example, these qualities are not necessarily supernatural, nor necessarily tied to infallibility. We then consider, even granting that these motives of credibility establish the magisterium as an effect from God, that this does not sufficiently connect these motives with the infallibility of the magisterium specifically, any more than it merely gives credibility to the sources of the magisterium's faith and morals, such as scripture. Therefore, one cannot credibly believe that the magisterium is infallible. But for sake of argument, assuming that these motives are the proposed reason for thinking the magisterium is necessary to know the infallibility of scripture, say, and infallible, and these motives equally justify the infallibility of scripture directly, no less than the magisterium's infallibility is no more justified than the scriptures. Hence, the magisterium is not necessary to establish the scriptures. And then returning to the former, these motives are not sufficient to credibly justify the infallibility of the magisterium. Therefore, one cannot know the magisterium to be the necessary, infallible teacher of faith and morals. So let's elaborate on that story. Consider a pope is considering some theological question and is about to make a dogmatic definition on the issue. Prior to that magisterial pronouncement, the Pope is, per himself, as a subject, fallibly thinking and investigating the issue. His confidence that his definition will be infallible simply anticipates that future dogmatic definition. Until then, any judgment he comes to is fallibly affirmed. When he does make the dogmatic definition, his confidence is not based on an infallible knowledge on his part, but faith in the infallibility of the magisterium, and his belief that the magisterium, via himself, has made that dogmatic teaching. In fact, every case where the magisterium makes an infallible promulgation of teaching, it does this first because the persons in the magisterium fallibly come to believe the teaching is true. Let's make it very clear, at least for the magisterium, they believe a doctrine not because it has been infallibly defined, but instead it is infallibly defined because they first believe it to be true. I'll repeat that. At least for the magisterium, those individuals in it believe a doctrine not because it has been infallibly defined, but because it is infallibly defined. But instead it is infallibly defined because they first believe it to be true. This is because the gift of infallibility is not like the gift of prophecy, whereby the subject has an immediate infallible knowledge of what is known. Rather, the Pope, along with the faithful, assent to this teaching not because they understand the Pope infallibly knows that it is true, but because an act of faith in the Magisterium. So we ask then, on what basis is this faith in the Magisterium established? There must be some reasons or motives establishing the credibility by which one can make an act of faith, by the Spirit granting the light of faith. One can appeal to some miracle. For example, Jesus in the Gospel of Mark says, "So that you may know that I have the power to forgive sins, I say to this man, take up your mat and walk." In that example, Jesus connects the miracle with the power to forgive sins before he performs the miraculous act. However, the Magisterium makes no such particular claim as that, at least with respect to infallibility per se, although there is a sense which they try to do so, which we may come back to. Now, the Magisterium could appeal to some external infallible authority, for example, Scripture or tradition, but of course, the Magisterium claims that such are only knowable as infallible by first faith in the Magisterium. Hence, the Magisterium must be established by the consequence of its own attributes. But such attributes that the Magisterium presents for itself, even if they were to provide a credibility to the claim that she has God for her cause, do not establish her quality of infallibility. Simply, any such qualities are not considered to require infallibility of the Magisterium as the particular object they confirm. Or rather, it is not established that had the Magisterium not been infallible, these qualities would not be present. And I present here a list of motives of credibility for the Church, found in Fenton, for example, and a hypothetical case in Sheehan's little catechism or teaching here. Therefore, there is not credible justification for believing the Magisterium is infallible, and so one cannot perform a prudential act of faith in the claims of the Magisterium. But let us suppose that these motives of credibility do establish the infallibility of the Magisterium. There is no privileged relation between these motives of credibility and the Magisterium's own infallibility, which is not also possessed in the relation of these motives of credibility and the infallibility of the Magisterium's sources, such as Scripture and tradition. Simply, these evidences which establish that the Magisterium is infallible, they aren't more connected to the Magisterium's infallibility any more than they are connected to the Scripture or even tradition's infallibility. Hence, they do not establish the Magisterium's infallibility in a privileged way, in a way that does not establish the Scripture's infallibility. Simply, why not simply say that these evidences also establish the infallibility of the sources of doctrine, or perhaps even only the sources of doctrine, rather than the Magisterium? For even if they merely establish the infallibility of the sources of doctrine alongside the infallibility of the Magisterium, the infallible affirmation of the Magisterium is no longer necessary to establish Scripture and tradition. Let's pause there. Simply, the claim is that if these motives of credibility equally establish the infallibility of the Magisterium's sources, apart from the Magisterium having to make the claim, explicit claim of their infallibility, then the Magisterium's explicit claim is not necessary in order to establish the infallibility of those sources. But returning to the former, no such evidences are brought forward to establish the infallibility of the Magisterium. Therefore, the Magisterium cannot be known to be a necessary, infallible teacher of faith and morals. Now, in the previous video, we demonstrated that according to Catholic theology, Scripture alone is the infallible per se source of doctrine, because sacred tradition, the act of the apostles orally disseminating teaching, is remote and mediated through fallible, that is, small t traditions, such as the opinions of theologians, the writings of church fathers, and the piety of the faithful, none of which are believed to be infallible in themselves. However, in that previous video, it was left open whether the Magisterium could infallibly guard and interpret the deposit of faith. In this video, we hope to have shown that faith in the Magisterium cannot be grounded and assented to with the assent of faith. In the next video, we provide a biblical case for Sola Scriptura. Thank you for watching.